And where we left off last week, you may remember we were talking about this thing here, the Secure Controls Framework last week. We spent a lot of time going down the rabbit hole of what this is. And just to give you a little bit of understanding of where I was and where we are going, I have learned about this framework from multiple colleagues and decided to educate myself on it. So over the past few weeks, I started to get familiar with this. I have used this in my work over the last year, but I will say I've done it without actually a whole lot of planning. I have more execution, so kind of reverse engineering the planning part. And last week, we got into the overview of what is the Secure Controls Framework. This is basically our overview slide. We covered the first three topics in the slide, what is and what is not SCF. We covered secure by design and privacy by design principles. And then we covered integrated controls management. And I felt like we were out of time. All of this content here comes directly from the SCF Start Here guide, which you can get right from the Secure Controls Framework website. And we're just going to pick up where we left off from last week. So we finished with the integrated controls management. I'm going to fast forward us, and today we're going to cover practical use of Secure Control Framework and the integrated controls management. And then we're going to wrap up with security and privacy capability maturity model. And there are two other areas which I don't plan to get into today just because it's so much detail. And I think we'll have enough information to say, hey, if you were thinking about using SCF, you've known enough that you can start digging into it. So that's what we're going to do here. Let me fast forward ourselves to the slides of the week. And we'll get ourselves started. All right, here we go. So, practical use of SCF and ICM. So, ICM is meant to be put into practice. This is integrated controls management. ICM is meant to be put into practice by organizations of any size or industry. The information below provides an understanding of available options to implement ICM with existing solutions. The SCF is a great way to implement the ICM. Okay, then. Well, let's find out more about what this thing is. Establish context. I'm not going to read everything on the slides here. I do have some notes, and I'll read some of my notes here that goes along with, in some cases, it's a wall of words. In other cases, we do have some visuals on the screen here. So first up, part of your due diligence process is to establish the context of the scope for cybersecurity and privacy controls. Practical steps to establish context includes four things. 1, read through the secure and privacy by design principles to familiarize yourself with the 32 domains to understand how they come together to address the cybersecurity, privacy, and physical security considerations for a modern security program. 2, talk with representatives outside of IT and cybersecurity to gain an appreciation of other compliance requirements, like talk with legal, procurement, physical security. Go talk with your partner teams. 3, come up with a list of the must-have laws, regulations, frameworks that your organization must comply with. The must-have, but laws and regulations and frameworks, okay. And then 4, come up with a list of nice-to-have requirements that your board of directors or other stakeholders feel are necessary. All right, so 3 is your must-haves, 4 is your nice-to-haves. It's interesting how they delineate those. Okay. Must-haves are laws, regulations, and required frameworks. Nice-to-haves are what your executive and your board team, other stakeholders find important. Okay, I like that. Understand the requirements for both cybersecurity and privacy principles involves a simple process of distilling expectations. This process is all part of documenting reasonable expectations that are right sized for an organization, since every organization has unique requirements. Some people freak out and think they have to do all 1,000 controls in the SCF. That's just not the case. It's best to visualize the SCF as a buffet of cybersecurity and privacy controls where there's a selection of 1,000 plus controls available to you. You do not You don't have to eat everything everything possible on the buffet table. I'm just reading some of my notes here, and there's some typos. You don't have to eat everything on the buffet table. Same applies to the SCF control set. Once you know what is applicable to you, you can generate a customized control set that gives you just the controls you need to address your statutory, regulatory, and contractual obligations. The approach looks at the following spheres of influence to identify applicable SCF controls. There's 4 of them: statutory, regulatory, contractual, and industry recognized practices. So, statutory obligations, these are the laws, state laws, federal laws, international laws. Regulatory obligations, these are the requirements from regulatory bodies or government agencies. Contractual obligations, these are requirements that are stipulated in contracts, customer contracts, partner contracts, vendor agreements, etc. And then 4, industry recognized practices. These are requirements that are based on an organization's specific industry that are considered reasonably expected practices. So please keep in mind that the SCF is a tool, and it is only as good as it's used. Just like a pocket knife shouldn't be used as a pry bar. Realistically, if you do not scope the controls from SCF correctly, you will not address your applicable compliance requirements since you are missing what is expected. This is not a deficiency of SCF. This is just simply negligence on the part of the user of the tool. Oh, take that. To make sure scoping is done properly, it is imperative for you to speak with your legal, IT, project management, cybersecurity, and procurement teams and any other stakeholders you feel may be relevant to the scoping controls. The reason for this collaboration is so that you can get a complete picture of all the applicable laws, regulations, frameworks that your organization is legally obligated to comply with. Those teams will likely provide the best insights into what is required, and that list of requirements then makes it simple to go through and customize your SCF for specific needs. All right, so we'll talk about this for just a second. Kind of my takeaway of this is whoever's running your SCF program, it's probably someone in your compliance team or your GRC team. The takeaway for them is go talk to your SecOps people, go talk to your product security people, go talk to your CISO. But go talk to legal, go talk to procurement, and kind of have those interviews with these people to get a sense of what matters to you, and you can pick through the list of controls to determine what matters. Again, the easy way to do this is to look at your compliance requirements and just apply the SCF controls that align with those requirements, and then that way your compliance aligns with SCF and the business as well. Let's move on. Moving on. Define applicable controls. So this is starting to give you a little bit of a view of what this thing looks like when it's actually in use. So this is actually part of the SCF download that you can grab. It's an Excel spreadsheet right from the Secure Control Frameworks website. So there's a column that exists in the SCF to help with the task of defining applicable controls. It's a column called the Minimum Security Requirements filter that'll help you with the process. The SCF is fundamentally an Excel spreadsheet. Therefore, you can use your Excel skills to manually filter the requirements. If you are comfortable with Excel, you'll take you like 5 or 10 minutes to do this filtering based on how the requirements, what you need to map to. So here's a cool thing. You don't need to build this. It's just, grab the file, download it, and then filter to your needs. As previously mentioned, the ICM is focused on defining the must-haves versus the nice-to-have requirements. The minimum compliance criteria are the absolute minimum requirements that must be addressed to comply with applicable laws, regulations, and contracts. I love that as your minimum requirements. It is laws. Discretionary security requirements are tied to the organization's risk appetite, since DSR are above and beyond MCC, where the organization self-identifies additional cybersecurity and data protection controls to address voluntary industry practices or internal requirements, such as findings from internal audit or risk assessments. Minimum security requirements is the resulting control set necessary to be compliant and secure to manage your organization's cybersecurity and privacy program. This is very cool. Using this spreadsheet, you find your must-haves to exist as a business legally. your nice to haves, what you want to do from a security perspective over and above your must haves. And then you have your list. Like, this is what we're going to do. These are the controls that we're going to focus on. Very, very interesting. And there's a lot more detail in the guide. I'm not going to read all the details from the guide, but I'm starting to see the value of grabbing this framework and having this part of kind of an onboarding assessment, or maybe an annual assessment. As we continue on, assign maturity-based criteria. Assign maturity-based criteria. Okay. From the previous step, you identify the controls that are applicable to your specific needs, your MCC and your DSR. You can now use the SPCMM. We're going to dig into this a little bit. With the SPCMM criteria, capability maturity model criteria, to define what right looks like for each control. The SCF doesn't tell you what to select. That's up to you to do that assessment, but this is where we're heading to next. So, one of the next pieces that is listed here in the guide is publishing policies and standards. So there are generally 3 options for obtaining cybersecurity and privacy documentation. 1, use internal resources to write them in-house. So we're talking about writing your policies and writing your standards. Compliance Forge has a guide here that we'll talk about in a second. Writing your policies and writing your standards after you identify your security controls. First, you can have people in-house write them. 2, you can hire a consultant to write a bespoke set of documentation, which if you're new to this, just go hire an audit consultant to help you there. Or 3, purchase a set semi-customized templates online. Compliance Forge is really good for this. And in fact, the document that's linked here, Compliance Forge wrote a document to help organizations understand cybersecurity and privacy documentation. It's available at complianceforge.com. It is one of their free resources to educate organizations on what proper cybersecurity and data protection documentation based on definitions from authoritative sources. These policies and standards provide the requirements that your organization has to adhere to. Okay. Assign stakeholder accountability. Assigning stakeholder accountability offers unique challenges for organizations since it is beyond IT, cybersecurity, and privacy. Okay. Common stakeholders involve HR, procurement, facilities, management, legal, and many other teams to ensure accountability is enforceable. Realistically, this step is an executive management function since it requires interdepartmental enforcement by organizational management. A great starting point is the NIST Special Publication 800-181, Workforce Framework for Security, the NICE framework. The NICE framework offers an efficient way to assign stakeholder accountability for internal and external stakeholders. It's available at the publications over at nist.gov. I have used this framework. It is very helpful. I've used some trimmed down versions of the framework, but I have found it useful. So just some takeaways on the notes from the SCF guide here. What is being said to wrong screen. What is being said to us here is determining who your account stakeholders are and assigning responsibility to your stakeholders is really an executive management function. So are you an advisory CISO? Are you, a security leader who's more kind of advising the business? Or are you taking the business by the reins and getting things done? I'd say this is kind of a tough function to do if you are an advisor. If you are saying, I advise the business, but I don't actually do the business. If you are more kind of an advisor to the business, then you might want to partner with someone else to take the lead on this, someone from your executive team. If you feel like you are a part of the executive team or you play a role where you are a part of the executive team, and this is something you can do yourself, like determine who your stakeholders are and assign accountability to them. Those are just my thoughts on that piece there. Maintain situational awareness. So maintaining situational awareness has different meanings based on the security culture of your organization. For some organizations, it means metrics, while for others, it means a broader understanding of control performance, risks, threats, and current vulnerability information. The Compliance Forge Security Metrics Reporting Model, SMRM, takes a practical view towards implementing a sustainable metrics reporting capability. At the end of the day, executive management, like your CIO, CEO, your board of directors, etc., they often just want a simple answer to a relatively straightforward question. Are we secure? In order for a CISO to honestly provide an answer, it requires a way for the CISO to measure and quantify an apples and oranges landscape where processes and technologies lack both uniform risk weighting and abilities to capture metrics. And what you're seeing here is kind of an intro to the NIST cybersecurity framework. Maybe we'll do a show on that at some point if you're not familiar. You have 5 big categories here trying to help you determine, are you secure? Categories of identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. It's one of the many frameworks that are actually in the SCF. It's also one of those frameworks that can help you determine your must-have and your nice-to-have security controls as well. Manage risk. So there are many ways to manage risk. In one of our upcoming episodes, we're going to have an upcoming episode that is all about risk management. So this is the SCF's take on managing risk. We'll do an overview of this in a couple weeks, or we'll do a deeper dive of risk from a wider lens in a couple weeks. So many ways to manage risk. However, the SPRMM, Risk Management Module, we'll see that in a moment. The SPRMM contains a control-centric risk catalog, threat catalog, and methodology to perform a risk assessment. 3 things. The value of the SPRMM is having a standardized methodology where controls are tied to specific risks and threats based on the other criteria offered by the SCF, like weighting and maturity criteria. The SPRMM makes calculating risk a straightforward process. Controls are the nexus of a cybersecurity and privacy program, so it is vitally important to understand how controls should be viewed from a high-level risk management perspective. To progress from identifying a necessary control to determining a risk, it's a journey that has several steps, each with its own unique terminology. Therefore, it's important to baseline the understanding risk management terminology. According to the Program Management Book of Knowledge Guide, the PMBOK, there's 3 things that matter: risk tolerance, risk threshold, and risk appetite. Risk tolerance is the specified range of acceptable results. Risk threshold is the level of risk exposure above which risks are addressed and below which risks may be accepted. And risk appetite is the degree of uncertainty an organization or individual is willing to accept in anticipation of a reward. It is important to note that the risk tolerance and risk appetite are not the same thing. In terms of cybersecurity materiality, risk tolerance matters. I actually use these. One, your auditors will ask in certain compliance frameworks about risk, and they will want to know kind of what your risk management looks like, and they'll actually want to know answers to these 3 things. Knowing your risk threshold, like do you have, when you kind of risk score things, what's the score that you will, as a business, just say, anything at this score and lower, we will just accept that risk and we're fine with it. But anything with a score of this number or higher, we're not going to accept that risk. We need to do something about it. Risk appetite is kind of a sense of, how risky is your business, right? How risk averse is your business? And so this is really getting a sense of your CEO and the company's culture as a whole. The intent of standardizing risk terminology for categories is so that all the organization's personnel can speak the same risk language across the enterprise. Categorization also allows management to compare and prioritize risks. So here's what's important. In working with your executive team, your board, and bringing up the terms risk tolerance, risk threshold, risk appetite, educating people on what these terms mean, and then actually putting an answer, a score around what these are for you. They'll help you and all of your stakeholders across the company all just speak the same language, because truthfully, your GRC team is the R risk in the GRC team are the utmost experts in this space. And it's up to you as a security leader to help educate and bring this to the rest of the business. Defining risk tolerance. What an ugly slide we have here. But defining risk tolerance, an organization's risk tolerance is influenced by several factors that includes, but not limited to, statutory, regulatory, and contractual compliance obligations, including adherence to privacy principles for ethical data protection practices, organizational specific threats, natural and man-made, and others. Risk tolerance is simplified as being one of the following three levels: low, medium, or high. Where's your risk tolerance, low, medium, or high? I'm not going to read through all of these, but of the three different levels, it's important to get a sense of what your risk tolerance is, right? A low risk tolerance, which means you want a high assurance security programs. Your moderate risk tolerance or medium risk tolerance, kind of a moderate level of security assurance, and then your high level of assurance. Each organization is different, and in the SCF it kind of talks about the different organizations and their assurance levels. Thinking about your risk determination, right? Risk management requires educating stakeholders for situational awareness and decision-making purposes. There are many options and formats available to report, but this can be considered your report on conformity, or ROC. You'll hear your compliance folks talk about the ROC from time to time. The reason for this is a risk assessment fundamentally is evaluating if an organization's cybersecurity and privacy practices support its stated risk tolerance. This approach can be summarized by reporting to the organization's management on the health of the assessed controls by one of the following risk determinations. 1, conform; 2, significant deficiency; 3, material weakness. Let's talk a little bit about what these are. So conforms. A ROC determination of conforms is a positive outcome due to deficiencies not being material to the cybersecurity and privacy program. This indicates that at a high level, the organization's cybersecurity and privacy program conforms to its selected cybersecurity and privacy practices. At the control level, there may be one or more deficient controls, but as a whole, the cybersecurity and privacy practices support the organization's stated risk tolerance. It is a statement that the assessed controls conform indicates to the organization's management that sufficient evidence of due care and due diligence exists to assure that the organization's stated risk tolerance can be achieved. All right, well, what is significant deficiency? A ROC designation of significant deficiency is a negative outcome due to the deficiencies being made by the cybersecurity and privacy program. Okay, and then what is material weakness? The ROC determination of material weakness is a negative outcome due to the deficiencies being made by the cybersecurity privacy program. So, material weakness. This indicates an organization is unable to demonstrate conformity with its selected cybersecurity and privacy practices due to deficiencies that make it probable that reasonable expected threats will not be prevented or detected in a timely manner. Okay. It's a statement that assessed controls have material weaknesses and indicates to the organization's management that 1, the cybersecurity or privacy program is incapable of successfully performing its stated mission, and 2, drastic changes to people, process, and or technology are necessary to remediate findings. So, material weakness means you probably need to make some changes in your leadership in your organization. So the evolve process. We touched on this last week. I'm going to take a sip of coffee before I get into it. You can take a quick view of this, and then we'll get into it. All right. So when we brought this up last week, the evolve process, or this process that's on the screen, we talked a little bit about it. This comes from Compliance Forge. The integrated cybersecurity governance model is what we're looking at here. And you can download this image in more detail at complianceforge.com. It takes a comprehensive view towards governing a cybersecurity and privacy program. Without an overarching concept of operations for the broader GRC function, organizations will often find that their governance, risk management, compliance, and privacy teams are siloed into how they think and operate. Those siloed functions are unclear roles, often stem from a lack of strategic understanding of how these specific functions come together to build a symbolic working relationship between the individual teams that enables quality control over people, processes, and technologies. And I'll be back in just a moment. Alrighty. All right, so now we'll come back. We'll dig into this thing here. So you'll see there's the image on the screen from Compliance Forge, and then with some little text box all around the screen, you'll see plan, do, check, act. So the integrated cybersecurity governance model utilizes plan, do, check, act. It's an approach in a logical way to design a governance structure. So let's go through each of these four things. Plan. The overall ICM process begins with planning. This planning will define the policies, standards, and controls for the organization. It will also directly influence the tools and services that an organization purchases, since technology purchases should address needs that are defined by policies and standards. Don't just buy tools. Write it into your policies and then get the tools. Got it. Do. Arguably, this is the most important section for cybersecurity and privacy practitioners. Controls are the security glue that make processes, applications, systems, and services secure. Procedures, also referred to as control activities, are the processes how the controls are actually implemented and controlled and performed. Implemented and performed. Yes, okay. Fixing my words. Check is the third one. Check. In simple terms, this is situational awareness. Situational awareness is only achieved through reporting, through metrics, and reviewing the results of audits and assessments. And then finally, act. This is essentially risk management, which is an encompassing area that deals with addressing two main concepts. One, real deficiencies that currently exist, and two, possible threats to the organization. So my takeaway of this from the SCF guide and what we just read through and looked at here is get yourself a copy from Compliance Forge of the Integrated Controls Governance Model, this thing here. And I see some value of kind of planning your program of what you are going to focus on from a governance perspective using the SCF controls and this guide here. And this could actually be a good management model for you to implement the SCF and also implement your governance program. All right, really interesting. Moving on to our second, I think this is our final topic of the day, security and privacy capability maturity model. So this is another document that comes to us from the SCF. It is introduced in the SCF Start Here guide. But this is, I think, the third document that they've introduced now in the SCF guide. So the SCF has built a maturity criteria for each control. The SPCMM is meant to solve the problem of objectivity in both establishing and evaluating cybersecurity and privacy controls. These are the three main objectives for the SPCMM. So there's three things we're going to talk about here. One, provide the CISO or Chief Product Officer or the CIO with objective criteria that can be used to establish expectations for a cybersecurity and privacy program. Two, provide objective criteria for project teams so that secure practices are appropriately planned and budgeted for. And three, provide minimum criteria that can be used to evaluate third-party service provider controls. There are likely many other use cases that the SPCMM can be used, but those three objectives listed above drove the development of the project. The reason for this simply comes down to a need by businesses, regardless of size or industry, for a solution that can help fix those three common frustrations that exist in most cybersecurity and privacy programs. We want to help eliminate or at least minimize the FUD that is used to justify purchases and or evaluate controls by injecting objectivity into the process. I find a lot of value in this. There's a lot of reading here and a lot of planning, but I'm seeing a lot of value in this as I'm getting familiar with this. So the SPCMM, defining what right looks like. The SPCMM draws onto the high-level structure of the Systems Security Engineering Capability Maturity Model, since we felt it was the best model to demonstrate varying levels of maturity or people, processes, and technology at a control level. If you are unfamiliar with the SSECMM, it's well worth your time to read through the SSECMM model description document that is hosted by the U.S. Defense Technical Information Center, DTIC. I know a little bit about it. I've used it in the past. I will say that I probably have not looked at it recently, but I put the link right into the slide here. You can screenshot that and type that in since you can't really click it. Okay, the 6 SPCMM levels are CMM 0, not performed. CMM 1, performed informally. CMM 2, planned and tracked. CMM 3, well-defined. CMM 4, quantitatively controlled. And CMM 5, continuously improving. Let's learn a little bit more about these things. Another wall of words for us here. Hopefully there's something interesting for everybody here. So the eye chart and table here summarizes the high-level expectations for small, medium, and large organizations to meet each level of maturity. So yeah, over on the right, it actually has 3 different organization sizes. I love that, and it kind of aligns with how I do security maturity assessments too. So this is aligns very much with something else that I do. So CMM 0, not performed. This level of maturity is defined as non-existence practices where the control is not being performed. There are no identifiable work products of this process. CMM 0 practices are a lack thereof are generally considered to be negligent. The reason for this is if a control is reasonably expected to exist by not performing the control, that would be negligent behavior. The need for the control could be due to a law, regulation, or contractual obligation, e.g. client contract or industry association requirement. CMM 1, performed informally. This level of maturity is defined as an ad hoc practices where the control is being performed but lacks completeness and consistency. Base practices of the process area are generally being performed. The performance of these base practices may not be rigorously planned or tracked. Performance depends on individual knowledge and effort, and there are identifiable work products for the process. CMM 1 practices are generally considered to be negligent. The reason for this is if the control is reasonably expected to exist by only implementing ad hoc practices in performing the control that could be considered negligent behavior. The need for the control could be due to a law, regulation, or contractual obligation. All right, CMM2. Tracked and planned. This level of maturity is defined as requirements-driven practices, where the expectations for controls are known, like their statutory, regulatory, or contractual obligations, and practices are tailored to meet those specific requirements. Performance of the base practices in the process area is planned and tracked. Performance according to specified procedures is verified, and work products conform to specified standards and requirements. CMM2 practices are generally considered to be audit-ready with an acceptable level of evidence to demonstrate due diligence and due care in the execution of the control. CMM2 practices are generally targeted on specific systems, networks, applications, or processes that require the control to be performed for a compliance need like PCI, HIPAA, or some NIST compliance. It can be argued that CMM2 practices focus more on compliance over security. The reason for this is the scoping of CMM2 practices are narrowly focused and are not organization-wide. So CMM2 is kind of your intro to passing the compliance checkbox. That's my take. CMM3, well-defined. This level of maturity is defined as enterprise-wide standardization, where the practices are well-defined and standardized across the organization. CMM3 practices are generally considered to be audit-ready with an acceptable level of evidence to demonstrate due diligence and due care in the execution of the control. Unlike CMM2 practices that are narrowly focused, CMM3 practices are standardized across the organization. It can be argued that CMM3 practices focus on security over compliance, where compliance is a natural byproduct of those secure practices. This is where things start to get good. I get it. There are well-defined and properly scoped practices that span the organization regardless of the department or geographic considerations. So, if I'm trying to be an actual secure organization and I'm using this type of model to help in my maturity, I'm shooting for nothing less than 3. Plain and simple. If I'm at an organization and I'm told just to shoot for 2, it's not the place I want to be. Other people might be fine with that, just compliance. But for me, 3 is the barrier to entry. CMM4, quantitatively controlled. This level of maturity is defined as metrics-driven practices, where the addition of being well-defined and standardized practices across the organization that are detailed metrics to enable governance oversight. CMM4 practices are generally considered to be audit-ready with an acceptable level of evidence to demonstrate due diligence and due care in the execution of the control, as well as detailed metrics enable an objective oversight function. Metrics can be daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, whatever. Okay, CMM5. Now we're getting up there. Continuously improving. Oh, so before we move on to 5. 4. You're fairly mature security organization. You've got metrics. You're able to produce those on a regular basis. Sounds like you got some thoughtful program management into your security and privacy program. Okay, CMM5. Continuously improving. This level of maturity is defined as world-class practices, where the practices are not only well-defined and standardized across the organization, as well as having detailed metrics, but the process is continuously improving. CMM5 practices are generally considered to be audit-ready with an acceptable level of evidence to demonstrate due diligence and due care in the execution of the control, and incorporates a capability to continuously improve the process. This is where artificial intelligence and machine learning would exist, since AI and ML would focus on evaluating performance and making continuous adjustments to improve the process. However, AI and ML are not requirements to be CMM5. Okay, that's kind of cool. So I could see organizations striving to get to 5, but some may actually be having culture conversations of asking yourself, like, okay, how important is compliance? How important is security? How important is privacy to our business? And some organizations may just say, it's too expensive. We just need to do what we need to do to run our business. In many cases, we're not talking about negligence. We're just talking about those who are just thoughtfully saying security and privacy are necessary to run our business, but it's not what we're using to drive our business. Other organizations will actually start to highlight that security and privacy is a focus to be a competitive advantage, right? How do we compete over our competitors? And some organizations will say we're going to compete over our competitors by demonstrating that we are very secure and very privacy conscious. And not only do we say during a security breach, we take security and privacy very seriously, but we actually do take security and privacy very seriously. Those are the companies that are going to be striving for CMM4 and CMM5. Personally, I actually find this model very valuable for a security leader to understand and bring this to your stakeholders, right? Most CISOs don't report to the CEO. They report to some other executive in the company, SVP or EVP level. Once you get your arms wrapped around this maturity model, bring it to your boss and help you and your boss come to a level of agreement for the business that you want to bring to the executive leadership team and bring to the board of where we want to focus as a business. Get the buy-in. You don't have to own this as a security leader. You get the buy-in of your stakeholders of where are we headed, from a small, medium, large perspective. Where are we headed? And small, medium, and large could be based off of revenue. Sometimes small that's we can make different determinations. In the past, I've made determinations of like a small company is, $5 to $15 million in revenue. A medium-sized company is from there up to a couple $100 million in revenue, and then a large company is $1 billion in revenue, and then extra large would be beyond that. But being able to have this conversation to say, where are we driving to? And when do we want to get there? This can be extremely valuable. I actually love this chart. It's different than the actual secure control framework themselves, but now it's helping you determine how would you implement all these different controls, or how do you help scope those controls? If you're realizing, hey, my company just wants to be CMM level 3, well, you're not going to be doing all 1,000 controls. You're going to be doing a whole lot less than that. Moving on. Defining a capability maturity sweet spot, very much with what we're just talking about here. For most organizations, the sweet spot for maturity targets is between CMM2 and CMM4. What defines the ideal target within this zone is generally based on resource limitations and other business constraints. So it goes beyond just the cybersecurity and privacy teams dictating targets. Identifying maturity targets is meant to be a team effort between both technologists and business stakeholders. From a business consideration, the increase in cost and complexity will always require cybersecurity and privacy leadership to provide a compelling business case to support any maturity planning needs. Speaking in terms the business can understand is vitally important. Negligence considerations. Without the ability to demonstrate evidence of both due care and due diligence, an organization may be found negligent. In practical terms, the negligence threshold is between CMM1 and CMM2. The reason for this is that CMM2 practices are formalized to the point that documented evidence exists to demonstrate reasonable steps were taken to operate and control. Let's talk about risk considerations. Risks associated with the control in question decreases with maturity, but noticeable risk reductions are harder to attain above CMM3. Oversight and process automation can decrease risk, but generally not as noticeably as steps taken to attain CMM3. Let's talk about process review lag considerations. Process improvements increase with maturity based on shorter review cycles and increased process oversight. What might have been an annual review cycle to evaluate and tweak a process can be near real time with AI or ML. Okay. Interesting, I guess. And then the last one, stakeholder value considerations. The perceived value of security controls increases with maturity. However, perceived value tends to decrease after CMM3 since the value of the additional cost and complexity becomes harder to justify to business stakeholders. Companies that are genuinely focused on being industry leaders are ideal candidates for CMM5 targets to support their aggressive business model needs. So that last piece very much aligns with what I was just talking about a moment ago, which is, where does your organization want to lie? Have this conversation with your executive team to find out where you really are at. I see a lot of companies striving to get to CMM3, get to level 3, and that's kind of where they stay. But have the conversation with your organization, because there are some organizations, some executive leadership teams, and some board of directors who may very well say, wait, we're only striving to get to 3. Why aren't we striving to 4 or 5? And many cases is to say that it's actually quite expensive to get to those higher levels. Relatively easy in the scope of things to get to level 3. But once you get to 3, it's quite difficult to get to 4 and 5 and keep with it. And as our company grows, it's harder to stay at those levels, and it's more expensive. So, you got to think about the cost and the complexity of your program to determine which level you really want to be at. I love this chart. I love the screen. I think it's very valuable for educating yourself and your executive leadership team. Moving on, SVP CMM, there's a couple use cases here. I'm probably just going to blast through these now that we're kind of high on time. I knew we were going to go through time pretty quick here today. So CMM use case 1, this is objective criteria to build a cybersecurity and privacy program. So I'll put the slide on the screen here and I'll read some of the notes I gathered. Identifying a target maturity state is intended to support your organization's mission and strategy. So without first understanding the broader mission of the organization and having prioritized objectives, a CISO or CIO or Chief Product Officer will be guessing when it comes to establishing expectations for capability maturity. Like anything in life, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. CMM rollouts are no exception. The time to execute a business plan to mature a cybersecurity and privacy program generally spans several years, where certain capabilities are prioritized over other capabilities. This means your CISO, CIO, CPO will establish CMM targets that evolve each year based on prioritization. In the graphic, the use of the spider chart can be beneficial to identify current and future gaps to the maturity model. Prioritization of capability maturities can be based on risk assessments, audits, compliance obligations, and management direction. You want to identify a problem, have some considerations for that problem. So first, identifying the problem. Using the capability maturity model helps organizations avoid moving targets for expectations. Maturity goals define what right looks like in terms of the required people, process, and technology that are expected to exist in order to execute controls at the individual contributor level. Without maturity goals, it is very difficult to be subjective and define success for security and privacy program. Let's talk about considerations. Cybersecurity and privacy departments are a cost center, not a revenue-generating business function. That means cybersecurity and privacy compete with all other departments for budget, and it necessitates a compelling business case to justify needed technology and staffing. Business leaders are getting smarter on the topic of cybersecurity and privacy, so these leaders need to rise above the FUD mentality and deliver value that is commensurate with the needs of the business. You need to go find a way to educate your leaders on why it's important to invest in these programs, but also have your leaders buy in. So you're not just selling it to them. You're saying, hey, where do we want to be? All right, great. Based off of our conversations as business leaders, we know where we want to be, and This is our path to get there over the next few years, and here's where we want to invest now. Okay. Use case number 2, assist project teams to appropriately plan and budget secure practices. When you consider regulations such as GDPR, there is an expectation for systems, applications, and processes to identify and incorporate cybersecurity and privacy by default and by design. In order to determine what is appropriate and to evaluate it prior to go live, it necessitates expectations for control maturity to be defined. So, similar to the other use case, let's identify the problem and let's talk about some considerations. So first, identifying the problem. In planning a project or initiative, it's important to establish what looks right from security and privacy controls that must be implemented to address all compliance needs. This includes internal requirements as well as external requirements from applicable laws, regulations, and contracts. Prior planning of requirements can reduce delays and other costs associated with re-engineering. Let's look at the considerations. So CMM levels 0 and 1 of maturity are identified as being deficient from a reasonable person perspective in most cases. Therefore, project teams need to look at the capability maturity sweet spot between CMM's level 2, 3, and 4 to identify the reasonable people, process, and technologies that are needed to be incorporated into the solution. As previously covered, avoiding negligent behavior is a critical consideration. The most common constraints that impact a project's maturity are 1, budget, and 2, time. Simple. Having an SDLC as constraints and expectations are that the security and privacy programs are applied throughout the software development lifecycle. Okay. And we have one more use case here. Use case number 3, provide objective criteria to evaluate third-party service provider security. So it's now commonplace for third-party service providers, including vendors and partners, to be contractually bound to implement and manage a baseline set of cybersecurity and privacy controls. This necessitates oversight of third-party service providers to ensure controls are properly implemented and managed. Even though my notes here look pretty sparse on the screen, I do have some notes here that I'll talk about. So first off, let's identify the problem and let's talk about considerations. So identifying the problem. In managing a cybersecurity and privacy program, it's important to address controls in a holistic manner, which includes governing the supply chain. Third-party service providers are commonly considered the soft underbelly for an organization's security program, since third-party service providers' oversight has traditionally been weak or non-existent in most organizations. There have been numerous publicized examples of third-party service providers being the source of an incident or a breach. One of the issues with managing third-party service providers is most questionnaires ask for a simple yes, no, or not applicable answers. This approach lacks details that provide critical insight into the actual security posture of the third-party service provider. The capability maturity model can be used to obtain more nuanced answers by having those service providers select from CMM level 0 to 5 to answer if the control is implemented and how mature the process is. Sounds like a lot of work for everybody. And it gets me into the third-party risk management topic, which we'll get to in another episode. Let's talk about some of the considerations for this use case. So CMM levels 0 and 1 of maturity are identified as being deficient from a reasonable person perspective in most cases. Therefore, organizations need to look at the capability maturity sweet spot between CMM 2 through 4 to identify the reasonable people, process, and technologies that third-party service providers need to be able to demonstrate to properly protect your systems, applications, services, and data, regardless where it's stored, transmitted, or processed. Third-party service provider management perspective, this is often going to limit target CMM levels to 2 and 3 for most organizations. From third-party service providers, controls are expected to cover both your internal requirements as well as external requirements from applicable laws, controls, contracts. Using the SPCMM can be an efficient way to provide a level of quality control over third-party service practices being able to demonstrate proper cybersecurity practices built upon the security principles protecting confidentiality, integrity, availability, and safety of your assets, including data. I think one of the biggest takeaways of this here is thinking about assessing your vendors, your third-party service providers. Where do they fall in your assessment of the capability maturity model? Because let's say you and your CTO or your CIO or your CEO says, we want to be CMM level 4 or 5 because we want to be an industry leader. We want to be world class. We want to have a competitive advantage. And your chief product officer says, hey, I want to bring a chat bot and integrate it into our SaaS product. And it's going to, make this really cool capability for our product and for our customers. And your security team assesses that chatbot and realizes the security and privacy controls of that company that manages that chatbot are very poor compared to where we are and where we're headed. And you're saying your company's headed to level 4 or 5 because you want to be that competitive leader, and you're implementing third-party tools into your products, which everybody is doing now. And those third-party tools are very immature. They're young companies. They only fall into like CMM level 2. What do? Right? The easiest thing you say is you bring this to your executive leadership team and say, this tool is high risk. It's a high-risk tool. It's failing our security third-party risk assessment. And here's our problem. It's their security is a level 2. We're a level 3 currently, and we're trying to get to level 4. This tool will never allow us to get to level 4. What do? And you let your executive leadership team make those decisions. You bring them the valuable information. You help weigh in, but you give them some realization of, do we really want to get to CMM level 4 or 5? Or are we just saying it? Do we really want this capability that's going to reduce our maturity? There's a trade-off there. It's a trade-off. I love this use case because this is real world. This is something that can be implemented. Well, folks, there are more sections in the secure control framework. I just want to give you a high-level overview. Like the next piece is in the risk management model. And it is something that I feel like at some point we could dig into, but it gets, again, a whole lot deeper, just like all the other areas are at. But I think we've covered quite a bit for the day, and I think I'm going to take a breather from this before we get on to our next section.